From excuses to obedience. Exodus chapter 4 verse 14 to chapter 6 verse 1. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 12 to chapter 56 verse 1. And Acts chapter 7 verses 35 to 37. Introduction. Have you ever tried to make excuses with your parents when they told you to do something, then suddenly you realized that you need to obey them? How does it feel? Last week, the angel of God appeared to Moshe in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. God called him by name and told him to remove his sandals, for the place was a holy ground. He introduced himself to Moshe as the God of his father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God told Moshe that he had seen the oppression of his people Israel, and that's the reason why he chose him to deliver them from Egypt. But Moshe gave excuses to God. First, he told God who he was to face the Pharaoh and to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. Second, he told God he was not an eloquent speaker, slow of speech, and slow of tongue. Third, he told God to send someone better. Our Torah portion starts with the anger of God to Moshe because of his reasonings. This time, God mentioned Aaron, the brother of Moshe, as he will be the one to speak on his behalf. And look, God knows that Aaron was on his way to meet Moshe and he will be glad. Verse 14, here, God still provided another way for Moshe, and this is an early lesson for us. When he calls us to serve him, surely he will provide our needs. Finally, Moshe was convinced and he obeyed God, so let's take a look what happened to him after. 1. Jethro sent him in peace. Verse 18, this is the first thing that Moshe did upon obeying God. He returned to the place of Jethro and asked to let him go and return to Egypt. The only thing he told Jethro was to see if his brethren there are still alive. But the details of God's calling him to deliver Israel from Egypt were left unsaid. Jethro released him and told him to go in peace. 2. Good news came to him. Verse 19, notice, after Jethro told Moshe to go in peace, he received good news that could give him a peace of mind, for all the men in Egypt who wanted to kill him were all dead, and one of them is the king. Chapter 2 verse 23. For sure, a thorn was pulled out of Moshe's throat upon hearing the news. 3. God's rod was put in his hand. Verses 20b to 21. Again, the Hebrew word for rod is matteh, which I discussed last week and has three meanings: staff, branch, and tribe. Going back to verse 2, God asked Moshe what he was holding and he said a rod. So God told him to cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. Moshe got frightened, but when God told him to reach it by the tail, he just followed as a proof that his trust and obedience to God had been developed. After that incident, Moshe saw that his rod was no longer ordinary, but behind it is the power of God, that Moshe's now holding to perform wonders in front of Pharaoh. 4. Aaron met him. Verses 27 to 31, since Moshe is not a good speaker, God provided someone for him, and that's his brother Aaron, but this is not just about Aaron being the spokesman of Moshe. In verse 15, Moshe must speak to Aaron and put the words in his mouth. In other words, Moshe will disciple Aaron because the instruction of God to him is to tell Aaron everything. He has nothing else to say except what only God had said. In Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 to 20, Yeshua said to his Talmidim, "Go and make Talmidim of all nations and teach them to obey everything I have commanded." Torah, U. 5. He was tested. Verse 5 verses 1 to 22. Yes, Moshe responded to the calling of God and obeyed him, but now his faith was tested. First, God told him to tell Pharaoh to let Israel go, but God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart. That's why when Moshe and Aaron confronted Pharaoh, he replied, "Who is this God that I should obey when he says to let Israel go?" Second, the Israelites blamed Moshe and Aaron for making them utterly abhorrent in the eyes of Pharaoh, and that prompted him to return to God and expressed his frustration. This part is a reminder to us that even if we obey God, we are not exempted from facing trials and testing. For the more we are being tested, the more we have to obey. These are the things that happened to Moshe the moment he obeyed God. Our Torah portion ends with the assurance of God to Moshe that this time, he will do something to Pharaoh that will force him to let Israel go and drive them out of his land. Our Haftarah portion deals with the strong message of God about the importance of observing Shabbat, and this is not only for the Jews, which many religious groups are using as an excuse, but even for the Gentiles. These are the proofs. 1. Happy is the person who does this and anyone who grasps it firmly. Verse 2, this verse is very clear that Shabbat is for everybody. Yeshua said in Mark chapter 2 verses 27 and 28, the Shabbat was made for man, and not man for the Shabbat. For Yeshua, man has no authority to change Shabbat or to choose any day he wants, because Shabbat is a moed, which means appointed time. 2. The word foreigners and eunuchs, verses 3 and 4, here, God reminds Gentiles that they can be part of his people. Ephesians chapter 3 verses 4 to 6, by referring to this, when you read you can understand my insight into the mystery of Yeshua, which in other generations was not made known to the sons of men, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit, to be specific, that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body, and fellow partakers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua through the gospel. Now for the case of the eunuchs, they are hopeless because they can't have children or family. But here, once they observe the Shabbat, there will be a miracle and blessing for them. God will give them power and a name greater than sons and daughters, an everlasting name that won't be cut off. At the end of our Haftarah portion, we can see the blessings and privileges that Gentiles could have in joining themselves to God and for keeping the Shabbat. Let us always remember that Yeshua entered the synagogue on the Shabbat, Luke chapter 4 verse 16, so if we are his true followers, we will observe it as well. John chapter 14 verse 15, if you love me, you will keep and obey my commandments. In apostolic portion, it is better to go back to Acts chapter 6 verses 9 to 15, for a better understanding of the situation of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, where he made a long speech in front of his accusers. Some men from the synagogue, including Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. But they can't win over him, so these men decided to accuse Stephen of blasphemy against Moshe and God. They influenced the elders and the scribes and brought Stephen before the council. This time Stephen defended himself, and he pointed out that God raised up prophets and leaders for the people of Israel, but they refused to listen, including Moshe. For Stephen, it was the so-called leaders of their time who violated the Torah of Moshe, and that's the reason why he challenged them. The bottom line of Stephen's long speech was about the rebellion of the people of Israel throughout their history, for they rejected God, the Torah, and even Messiah Yeshua. That's why Yeshua said in John chapter 5 verses 46 and 47, for if you believed Moshe, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? The connection of our parasha is about obedience to God and avoiding making excuses. In the Torah, after Moshe gave excuses to Adonai when he was called to serve, finally he obeyed and good things followed him. In Haftarah, Gentiles can't make any excuses in obeying the Shabbat, because happy or blessed is the man, not Jews only, who keeps it. In apostolic, Stephen defended not only himself but even Moshe in front of the council, that Moshe was called and sent by God to be a ruler and deliverer of Israel, and he obeyed after making an excuse. Back to my introduction, obedience to God is a sign that we love him. We are not born to make excuses, but we were born to fear God and obey his commandments, for this is our whole duty. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 13. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. John chapter 14 verse 15. If you love me, you will keep or obey my commandments. Shabbat Shalom.